Good evening, welcome to this special edition of Twisted Tales, presenting Ramsey Campbell, a Gothic festival special event. This event has been organised with Liverpool's International Gothic Festival.
Well, okay. Well, this was short notice, as we all know. So, in fact, this is my extemporised thing about Liverpool, me, and the Gothic. And I think there's no better book to start with as a kind of primer of Liverpool Gothic than this one. And if anybody's interested in the theme and doesn't know it, I strongly recommend it. It's published by the inestimable PS Publishing. I think it is still in print, I'm sure. And it is, in fact, a book of Liverpool dark fantasy, Gothic, horror. Let me just backtrack a little bit before I get and talk interminably about my own stuff. And just to consider, you know, the Gothic Liverpool, and you know, authors who've used it. Actually, to be honest, I'm not very sure that many did before this generation that's represented in this book. The Belgian writer Jean Rey actually wrote a story called The Mate's Psalter. Now, Rey, despite being Belgian, set a great deal of his stuff in England and Scotland. As far as I know, he didn't actually visit, but you know, he researched it a little bit. And this particular story, which sounds as if it's about an M.R. Jamesian haunted, you know, sacred book, actually it's not. It's the name of a ship. And in the story, the protagonist starts off staying in a boarding house in Liverpool. Now, the actual use of Liverpool in that isn't particularly Gothic, so you know, it's only, you know, by courtesy I'm including him. G.G. Pendarves, who wrote a couple of dozen stories for Weird Tales in the 20s and 30s, Weird Tales magazine, she in fact lived around Liverpool for a number of years. He's actually buried in Rape Lane Cemetery in Wallasey, not half a mile from our house. And she set one story called Thing of Darkness, which was rather a good story. It was reprinted a couple of times in Weird Tales magazine, in a very thinly disguised version of Park Gate, called Seagate, if I remember correctly. That's quite an effective little tale. She came from Cornwall, there's a sort of Cornish influence in the story too. Well, not influence, but reference. But that really does bring us, I think, to this generation. And it's interesting to me to think about this, that actually Clive Barker has not actually set that great an amount of his fiction on Merseyside, despite having been born. I say this not to denigrate Clive's immense body of work, but simply to remark on this particular, you know, local significance. So much so that they actually had to put in his story, The Forbidden, Angus decided to put in. Although, in fact, my sense of it was set in a London estate, suburban estate, rather than in Liverpool. It certainly doesn't refer to the town in which the estate is set by name at all. Of course, you probably know it was filmed as Candyman, and it was then relocated to Chicago. It's a kind of an odd sense of Clive's, what you might almost call the mid-Atlantic party with Clive in a way, because you know, that there are elements in Hellraiser, the film, where there's a strange sense that, you know, it's being, even though it's being shot in England, there are people speaking with these curious American accents to placate the American audience, as they seem to be taking place in an almost no man's land. I must put in more than a word for my old friend Peter Atkins, who I think is by far the most Scouse of the three of us. And yet has an extraordinary combination in some of his stories, particularly a couple of the stories in here, of, you know, kind of Scouse wit and Macanesque, that is Arthur Macanesque, a sense of visionary awe and terror. There's a story here called The Mystery, which is indeed set in the park just off Smithtown Road, but it is also about a numinous and very curious mystery as well. I mean, I actually do think his combination of these elements is unique. Certainly, you know, I've never touched it. And now, sadly, after all that preamble, I'm not going to drone on mostly about my own stuff. So where do I begin? Well, let me see here. I guess I begin with the very first stories that I actually set in Liverpool, and I want to put that into a bit of a context. Even the whole sort of Gothic sense that I certainly had by then of Liverpool really came from a variety of sources. Now, 14 years old, I read what was in fact the very first British paperback of H.P. Lovecraft, a book called Cry Horror, which contains some of his very finest stories in Color Out of Space, called Cthulhu, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and also some of his lesser stuff. But I gobbled this entire book up in a day, and I genuinely felt this is what I want to do. I've been tinkering around with imitating other writers for years, but here, 14 years old, I decided this is what I want to achieve, and so I set about imitating Lovecraft. To put it mildly, very slavishly, but that's a matter for another discussion, really. 14, getting on for 15. Another crucial factor, which it may not sound immediately relevant, was I was now able to pass for 16 and get into all the X movies that I've been reading about in Famous Monsters of Filmland for years, and I've been wanting to see, and now at last I can see them. But actually, all you need was the confidence to appear to be 16. You could usually get in most of the cinemas. But the other thing was that, curious accompaniment, isn't it? But it's going to be all the better on the video, I don't doubt, being accompanied by this ethereal choir. Anyway, okay, could get into X movies, and Liverpool became this enormous adventure for me, because apart from anything else, I really hadn't ventured very far outside my own tiny territory, Wavertree, for most of my life. I mean, I was an extraordinarily timid character. That's why I became a writer, obviously, because that was a way to talk, rather than trying to talk face to face to people. But also, I mean, I genuinely had not gone far. And Liverpool seemed to be like the world, or certainly a world, this enormous place with ramifications in every direction, districts I'd never ventured into, and could only reach by, public transport at night often, and this in itself became a tremendous adventure. So add to that, there's a lot of Liverpool, a surprising amount, even in the early 60s, and actually later than that, was still basically scarred, to put it mildly, by the Blitz. So you had whole areas which consisted of nothing but, derelict streets, houses without roofs, without walls, and a cinema stuck in the middle of this. It somehow just survived. A lot of the rest of the stuff had been pulled down, but the cinema was still keeping going. These were the last days, really, the last years of the suburban cinema in Britain, most of them. But so everything was kind of mixed up for me with going to see all these horror movies I'd never seen before, reading Lovecraft and being imbued with his sense of kind of cosmic awe and terror, and just the sheer adventure of discovering this enormous place that was Liverpool. All of which kind of gradually merged together, I think, in some of the stuff that I wrote. As I say, the very, very first story that I did write was when I was 19. That was the very first story set in Liverpool that I wrote. I mean, I'd been already published for years by then. I'll read you a short extract. Having flaked all colour from the sky, the snow had stopped, but an insistent rain troubled the pigeons picking their way among the debris of St Luke's Church. Vic jerked Julie's umbrella and it bloomed above them the same sunny orange as her coat. They crossed into Bow Street and passed the sonorous entrance of the Odd Spot Club. Vic was about to speak when a furtive-looking man with an armful of bottles pushed between them and was lost in the vestibule of 69A. Now I have to parenthesise here, because that was actually the old clubroom of the Liverpool Science Fiction Group, was 69A. It was above Helen's Leather Goods, which is open suspiciously late at night, and she seemed to have an enormous number of visitors. Never did quite figure out what leather goods she was doing, but there you are. The arrow-headed rentals and the gutter accompanied them into Church Street, where commuters ventured from the cold grey bulk of Central Station and ducked back. An icy wind slanted the rain toward them down the narrow two-way street. The drenching gust raised goose pimples on the cars and herded the pedestrians into shop doorways to choke on the stench of raincoats. Vic grimaced and waited for the army at the curb for traffic lights to permit him to join battle with the mob across the street. The drivers sat and cleaned their windscreens with their hands. When he reached it, Julie was enjoying the brief plush warmth of the Tatler cinema entrance before the pallid splendour of the House of Beaulieu and the Cardoma coffee house. He urged her on. The rain still streamed down the toadstool buffer, sooty buildings with the kaleidoscopic shops which served as their foundations, their windows full of lifeless shoes and dresses. Over all detached, the street lamps poured, and above the roofs the live building clocks stood with hands on hips. Well, this was all back when, Church Street was actually a two-way thoroughfare, cars, buses going up and down it. And all these buildings, all these shops are gone. But here we are. Fewer feet splashed through the dirty puddles at the end of Church Street. They skirted the cloaked black figure among the Victoria Monument's pillars and hurried down the line of parking meters like hooded cobras. And on either side, the discreet life insurance buildings with their golden nameplates mounted to wild turrets. Vic led the way below the regimented windows and cream rain-striped walls of exchange flags. Scattered men and women, dwarfed by the ebon figures, chained below a wartime motto, ran from the scything rain. Here Julie lost her way. They wandered through a maze of streets whose sides attended to unlabelled blackened doors, past makeshift bookstalls cloaked in drooling oilskin, between opaque windows and boarded doors. Very far away, it seemed, a steamer blew its nose. Then, when she was least expecting it, she was led through a gaping arch between two silent storage houses into an inner court, across the slimy cobbles to a railing which boxed in a long, heavy trapdoor, hooked back to show treacherous stone steps burrowing into rectangular darkness. But it's kind of shifted into the Gothic mode, almost imperceptibly, although I have to say that it was based on a real place. And that is actually a literal description of that walk from St Luke's Church, along Church Street, up Castle Street, ultimately to what were then a whole maze of cellars beneath Rumford Place near the old Post and Echo building. But that's basically how I saw these things, and it was indeed. I mean, a friend of mine who had a bookshop there introduced me to these cellars. So you'll like these, and tell me to get a flashlight. And I did indeed explore them, and very exciting they were. In a very strange, with a tinge of dread, which is what I like, guys. Which is why I write this stuff. And I think that's kind of important, that so much of it is almost a literal description of what was there. And I mean, I've always believed in this, and to a surprise. Well, let me give you another example. This was my first novel. The Doll Who Ate His Mother, and it is not very good. I mean, it's got bits I like and a lot that I don't. But it is clearly a first novel. But probably the most interesting thing in the context is, again, it's set in Liverpool, and Steve King in Danse Macabre specifically drew attention to Liverpool as he thought almost the central character of the story. And so Liverpool 8 is a kind of slumbering monster, as he put it. Well, how right he was, you must decide for yourselves. I'll read you just a little piece from this, from a late chapter in the book. I'm editing as I go along, because some of the stuff doesn't really have a great deal of resonance if you've not read the rest of the book. However, he's in the character is in Prince's Avenue. He strode across the reservation and into a side street toward Mulgrave Street. Most of the windows on the terrace were full of planks or doors, like an infection. A few houses had resisted, cars stood outside. Trees were stuck in the pavements, a decaying handbag hung from a branch, a bicycle tire drooped from another. A rag and bone man passed him, wheeling a cart with a thick, wailing, incomprehensible shout. In one of the occupied houses, a broken window was backed with a piece of cardboard. Eggs, it said in the frame of jagged glass. The cart clattered away. The man shouted thickly at the houses. Chris emerged onto Mulgrave Street. The deep blue sky fell open. Around him, white clouds lay tangled on the horizon like convoluted bones. The sunlight accumulated on the back of his neck. For a moment, the landscape stirred restlessly. He gazed along Mulgrave Street and its crossroads on the waste. One of the streets was amberly. He walked toward Upper Parliament Street. Lamps had stooped long concrete necks over the roadway. Trees sprouted from the rubbly pavements of levelled side streets. Beyond the corrugated tin wall, a mechanical shovel howled and spewed bricks. A lorry laden with spades and pickaxes stood outside the wall. The next terrace wasn't Amberley Street. He gazed at the tin that filled the houses, bewildered. Beyond the houses, a doll whose cracked mouth was stuffed with mud sat in a pram without wheels. Beyond that, he saw a single house, its yard walls still intact. A street lamp stood outside. There was even a street plaque on the house wall. He began to run. Amberley Street. It was a grey 3-storey house. The windows were full of shattered holes, but curtains panted feebly within, colourless as vegetation trapped beneath stone. One sash was almost blind with boards. Beneath its glass a curtain stirred. Small attic windows hung with grey curtains stood forward from the attic roof. The front yard was cramped close to the house. Tufts of grass and weeds sprouted through a scattering of glass and slate. The basement windows were nearly buried. The brows of their sashes stood emptily above the surface of the yard. 3 steps led up to the front door, which was dull brown, partly charred and blistered. The flap of the letter slot hung askew beside a large rusty doorknob. Above them, an intact front door was as he approached, Chris glanced at the adjoining set of steps. Above them, an intact front door was displayed in a jagged frame of brick. Beyond it, a hall with flowered wallpaper led out onto rubbly waste. Now, the simple thing about that is it's all a literal description of what was there. Again, I was saying this stuff around, well, it was basically around the Granby Street area, which is partly because we had our first flat in Princes Avenue, actually, and so we knew the area pretty well. But that was it. That was exactly how it was when I did the walk. Again, obviously, nothing can be absolutely literal. It's all a process of selection. And also, it's the eye that sees that decides what the reader sees. But all the same, that really was, that was exactly how it was. Which is to say, pretty damn Gothic. You didn't have to try too hard, basically. Here's a little bit from a story that's actually set in West Derby. And I think, okay, let me just do this very small piece. A story called The Depths, in which, funnily enough, were I a suspicious person, I would say this is quite similar to a recent film called Sinister with Ethan Hawke. However, this was published 25 years earlier. But there you are. But no, I think its ideas are in the air, and a lot of it is coincidence. However, this is basically about a writer who visits houses in which murders have taken place and stays in them in order to write the book, which was indeed what Sinister was about as well. Anyway, there you go. So, just a couple of paragraphs. This is in West Derby. Long dark houses slumbered beyond an archway between cottages. Lit windows hovered in the arch. A signboard reserved a weedy patch of ground for a library. A grey figure was caged by the pillars of the village cross. On the roof of a pub extension, gargoyles began barking, for they were dogs. A cottage claimed to be a sawmill, but the smell seemed to be of manure. Though his brain was taking notes, it wouldn't stop nagging. He gazed across Lord Sefton's estate towards the tower blocks of Cantrell Farm. Their windows were broken ranks of small bright perforations in the night. For a moment, as his mind wobbled on the edge of exhaustion, the unstable patterns of light seemed a code which he needed to break to solve his problems. But how could they have anything to do with it? Such a murder in Cantrell Farm, in the concrete barracks among which Liverpool communities had been scattered, he might have understood. Here in West Derby, it didn't make sense. As he entered the deserted close, he heard movements beneath eaves. It must be nesting birds, but it was as though the sedate house had secret thoughts. He was grinning as he pushed open his gate until his hand recoiled. The white gate was stickily red. It was paint. Someone had written sadist in an ungainly, dripping scrawl. Well, there you go. I think the thing about that is how it does make the kind of connection between, the areas of Merseyside in a way, West Derby, which is your classic sort of middle or even upper middle class suburban enclave, and Cantrell Farm, which is is something I use in another book actually, for The Face That Must Die, an early novel of mine, which is basically we had a friend there who got lost because he couldn't find his way back to his own street. It's had this extraordinary sort of anonymity, concrete anonymity. I think they've changed the name eventually and rebuilt it to some extent. To what benefit, I'm not actually sure. So I think I come to, I do indeed come to what I do regard as my ultimate Liverpool novel. And it was kind of 15 years, not in the writing, but in the preparation. Obviously not, I was doing nothing else. Quite the contrary, I was researching this novel while I was writing any number of other things. But particularly whenever I was in, as a great haunter of second-hand bookshops, whenever I was in one of those, I would look to see if there's anything about Liverpool, and the rarer the better. So I do have a fair old shelf of books about Liverpool published in the mid-19th century, some of them never reprinted since, and one or two. I mean, there's actually a description of the latter half of the 18th century from the viewpoint of the middle of the 19th, which is extremely useful, entirely about Liverpool. And basically, the stranger the detail, the more obscure, the better. And I kept a whole notebook of these things. What interested me now is, when I eventually came to write the novel, I had all these notebooks full of stuff. To some extent, I no longer know what I invented. I mean, some of it I just transcribed direct from the books about Liverpool. Sometimes it would set me off with an idea, and I'd do a bit of a riff on the detail I'd found in these volumes, and sometimes it would actually, suggest to me an invention. So some of the legends and traditions and strange tales of Liverpool in this book, I don't know if I invented them or not anymore. I cannot tell the fiction from the reality, which is exactly what this book is about in some ways. It's very much about Liverpool being composed of legends and traditions. So let me do a little bit. Let me see. Okay, yes, all right. And I mean, okay, I'll do this little bit. Now, crucially to the story, the narrator is someone who does a tour, not too unlike the Liverpool tours, actually. I mean, I didn't know about them when I started planning the idea. And I nearly called it, in fact, my initial idea was to call it Liverpool. Well, obviously not, no, I'm not going to do that. It's actually Liver Ghoul, which is, kind of similar. It's not quite as good as Liverpool, but what the hell, it'll do. So he does these tours, which are not entirely ghostly, but they're guided tours, walking tours of macabre and strange locations in Liverpool, or more correctly, locations of macabre and strange events. So, okay, here's a little bit of stuff. And I may as well say this book is set quite largely around where we are right now. I mean, it was written, in fact, before Liverpool 1 was constructed. It was written in the middle of this previous decade, actually. So, had I written it a couple of years later, it might have been a different novel. But there's still certainly very much, the sense of things bubbling up from beneath the new developments. And so undeniably that's going to carry on. You walk along Whitechapel, you'll still see the pool seeping up. They can't keep it down. That's very much one of the things this book is about. Okay, let me give you just a sort of random-ish kind of bit, since this is set quite close. This is part of his tour. Above Lord Street, the dark sky looks ready to collapse, and the tubular concrete tower that houses a radio station is supporting a cloud, like the nest of a great bird. A few brave tourists flourish cameras on the upper deck of an open-top bus that passes my party and turns left along North John Street. The south branch of the street was once Love Lane, leading to the custom house of the oldest dock, where yet another stretch of water was subsequently drained. The dock became Canning Place, where in 1840 creatures with too many limbs or eyes or heads, or alternatively too few, were exhibited. South John Street is presently a trail of rubble above which helmeted workmen perch on scaffolding that sketches an imminent mall, and I wondered if my father talked to any of them. Perhaps I should ask, but not now. Instead, I conduct the party past the stores on Lord Street to Whitechapel. I knew my best to douse the lurid flame of memory by turning to Paradise Street, formerly the common shore, across the intersection. Most of it is fenced off by builders, and shops and a pub have occupied the Royal Colosseum. Known to its friends as the Collie, it put on a play written by the stage manager, Princess Park in Scotland Road, or Vice in Liverpool. Before its theatrical years, it was a Unitarian chapel. Theatre goers had to enter through the old graveyard, and a vault was used as a dressing room. Bones could be found at its depths beyond a flimsy partition, and some of them were used as props in plays. I'll just own up to that one, that is real. Just in case you thought I made that up, I didn't. I lead the way along Church Street past the block of shops that is a raised church alley, the birthplace of James Maybrick. The narrow lane bordered the churchyard of St. Peter's, where his brother Michael became known as precociously youthful organist. When the church was demolished about a century ago, the contents of some of the coffins were found to have turned to stone. How soon did James become jealous of his musical brother? The family lived in the alley until James was 13. Perhaps he was one of the children who had to be chased away from Joseph Williamson's grave. Whatever made them play some forgotten version of hopscotch on the slabs around it? Joseph Williamson died on May Eve in 1840, less than 2 years after James was born, and a year before Michael's birth. The mysterious builder was buried with his wife in a crypt of St. Thomas's Church at the far end of Paradise Street, less than 5 minutes' walk from the Maybrick house. 2 minutes would have taken James to Whitechapel or the Collie or the Liver Theatre, originally the dominion of fancy on the upper floor of shops in Church Street. I've let this have been diverted by Maybrick. This isn't my night tour and I'm not sleepwalking, whatever Waterworth said. But on the side of the Liver Theatre, Mill Street leads uphill to the district where the poets of the Beatles era dwelled and wrote and drank. Around the corner is Hanover Street to the Neptune Theatre, which sounds as if it ought to be beside the pool. As I tramped down Folly Lane, or rather Islington, away from my parents' house, the weight of the sky laden with darkness appears to press layer after layer of the cityscape into the river. The students at the university halfway down the slope have gone home for the summer, but delegates at a conference on the history of seaside resorts are converging on the campus theatre opposite the Collegiate, which looks more like a stage set than ever. In the middle of the 18th century, Liverpool was a seaside resort, bringing actors up north to entertain the holidaymakers, while the London theatres were shut for the season. I'm struck by the notion that everyone was enticed here by water. Thirst is making my throat feel as rough as my skin where I wiped off the drip. I'm alongside London Road now, and I imagine drinking from the Moss Lake stream that fed the pool. The thought brings an image of silhouettes lapping at the pool or raising handfuls of it to their faces. The vision is lit by a moon. I can't distinguish how many of the drinkers are human, nor whether the forms arising to meet them are their reflections. The image is so vivid while it lasts, and I can think my thirst is giving me a fever. 200 years ago, I would have seen stalls in the Welly Market ahead, between St. George's Hall and the Old Law Courts. I assume the nickname originated with the well around which the market flourished until outbreaks of violence led to a ban, and perhaps Wellington kept the name alive. He's perched on a towering column beside a fountain, where children are dancing around the inside of the stone bowl as if they're performing a ritual to summon up water. The sight exacerbates my thirst as I trudge down Shaw's Brow, where a lunatic asylum faced whatever was to be seen on the heath, lights which belonged on the marsh, according to one inmate, who also spoke of hopping figures lit by them or from within. The asylum was demolished by the time Shaw's Brow became William Brown Street, and the Central Library stands there now. And some of that is true. I leave you to decide. Well, I guess what I might want to do now is a short story and then throw the whole show open for questions. How does that sound? Many years ago, this would have been, I suppose, the very early 80s, I should think, the then features editor of the Daily Post approached me to do a ghost story for Christmas, and very specific he was about it. He wanted something about 2,000 words, starting Christmas Eve, finishing New Year's Eve, using as many Merseyside locations as I could reasonably get in, a ghost story, and, well, that was it. Well, that's enough, isn't it? That's a fair old set of parameters. So I wrote him this story, and he said, it's too horrifying, we can't publish it. So we presumably didn't know much about my stuff, I don't know. Or perhaps he expected me to be sedate for Christmas. Well, no, actually I write on Christmas Day anyway, so, don't expect that of me. So in fact I sold it a couple of years later to Weird Tales magazine in America when Lynn Carter was editing. Let me just say this to you. The story is actually called First Foot. How many people did that mean anything to as a title? Yeah, some, but not all. Okay. So, all right, that's fair enough. So, Lynn actually said, we were on a train to Providence for a World Fantasy Convention. We were, and he called me in the eye and said, look, I'm going to buy your story, but Americans won't get your title, so give us another title. So I thought for a couple of minutes, okay, calling card, and it's been that ever since. And obviously, given your reaction, I was right to change it, even for Britain. Now, a few years later, as I said, published in weird terms. A few years later, the feature editor of the Daily Post approached me, the different feature editor, saying, "Will you write us a ghost story?" So I thought, oh, okay, sent him this story. They published it. So I have no idea what that proves. Coarsening of sensibilities, no doubt, or the fact that I've clearly become, more respectable with age, which is why I've been invited here tonight, obviously. God, expecting respectability, how little they know. Dorothy Harris stepped off the pavement and into her hall. As she stooped groaning to pick up the envelopes, the front door opened, a yawn that wouldn't be suppressed. She wrestled it shut. She must ask Simon to see to it, though certainly not over Christmas. Then she began to open the cards. Here was Father Christmas, and here he was again, apparently after dieting. Here was a robin like a rosy apple with a beak, and here was an envelope whose handwriting staggered. Simon's and Marjorie's children, perhaps. The card showed a church on a snowy hill. The hill was bare except for a smudge of ink. Though the card was unsigned, there was writing within. A very happy Christmas and a prosperous New Year, the message should have said, but now it said a very harried Christmas and no New Year. She turned back to the picture, her hands shaking. It wasn't just a smudge of ink. Someone had drawn a smeary cross on the hill, a grave. Though the name on the envelope was a watery blur, the address was certainly hers. Suddenly the house, the kitchen and living room, the two bedrooms with the memories stacked neatly against the walls, seemed far too large and dim. Without moving from the front door, she phoned Marjorie. "Is it Grandma?" Marjorie had to hush the children while she said, "You come as soon as you like, Mummy." Lark Lane was deserted. An unsold Christmas tree loitered in a shop doorway, a gargoyle craned out from the police station. Once Marjorie had moved away, the nearness of the police had been reassuring. Not that Dorothy was nervous like some of the old folk these days, but the police station was only a community centre now. The bus already sounded like a pub. She sat outside on the ferry, though the bench looked and felt like black ice. Lights fished in the Mersey, gulls drifted down like snowflakes from the muddy sky. A whitish object grabbed the rail, but of course it was only a gull. Nevertheless, she was glad that Simon was waiting with the car at Woodside. As soon as the children had been packed off to bed so that Father Christmas could get to work, she produced the card. It felt wet, almost slimy, though it hadn't before. Simon pointed out what she'd overlooked, the age of the stamp. "We weren't even living then," Marjorie said. "You wouldn't think they would bother delivering it after 60 years. A touch of the Christmas spirit." "I wish they hadn't bothered," Marjorie said. But her mother didn't mind now. The addressee must have died years ago. She turned the conversation to old times, to Marjorie's father. Later she gazed from her bedroom window at the houses of Bebbington, sleeping in pairs. A man was creeping about the house, but it was only Simon laden with presents. In the morning the house was full of cries of delight, gleaming new toys, balls of wrapping paper big as cabbages. In the afternoon the adults, bulging with turkey and pudding, lolled in chairs. When Simon drove her home that night, Dorothy noticed that the unsold Christmas tree was still there, a scrawny, glistening shape at the back of the shop doorway. As soon as Simon left, she found herself thinking about the unpleasant card. She tore it up, then went determinedly to bed. Boxing Day was her busiest time, what with Christmas dinner marked 2, and making sure the house was impeccable, and finding small presents for the children to find. She wished she could see them more often, but they and their parents had their own lives to lead. An insect clung to a tinsel globe on the tree. When she reached out to squash the insect, it wasn't there, neither on the globe nor on the floor. Could it have been the reflection of someone thin outside the window? Nobody was there now. She liked the house best when it was full of laughter, and it would be again soon. "We'll get a sitter," Marjorie promised, "and first foot you on New Year's Eve." That reminded Dorothy to offer the children a holiday treat. Everything seemed fine, even when they went to the door to leave. "Grandma, someone's left you a present," little Denise cried. Then she cried out and dropped the package. Perhaps the wind had snatched it from her hands. As the package, which looked wet and mouldy, struck the curb, it broke open. Did its contents scuttle out and sidle away into the dark? Surely that was the play of the wind, which tumbled carton and wrapping away down the street. Someone must have used her doorway for a waste bin, that was all. Dorothy lay in bed, listening to the wind which groped around the windowless side of the house that faced onto the alley. She kept thinking that she was on the ferry, backing away from the rail, forgetting that the rail was also behind her. Her nervousness annoyed her. She was acting like an old fogey, which was why next afternoon she walked to Otterspool Promenade. Gulls and planes sailed over the Mersey, which was deserted except for boys. On the far bank, tiny towns and stalks of factory chimneys stood at the foot of an enormous frieze of clouds. Sunlight slipped through to Birkenhead and Wallasey, touching up the colours of microscopic streets. Specks of windows glinted. She enjoyed none of this, for the slopping of water beneath the promenade seemed to be pacing her. Worse, she couldn't make herself go to the rail to prove that there was nothing. Really, it was heartbreaking. One vicious card, and she felt nervous in her own house. A blurred voice seemed to creep behind the carols on the radio, lowing out of tune. Next day she took her washing to Lark Lane, instead of distraction as much as anything. The Westinghouse laundromat was deserted. Oh, 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 the washing machine said emptily. There's only herself and her dervishes of clothes and a black plastic bag almost as tall as she was. If someone had abandoned it, whatever its lumpy contents were, she could see why, for it was leaking. She smelled stagnant water. It must be a draught that made it twitch feebly. Nevertheless, if she had been able to turn off her machine, she might have fled. She mustn't grow neurotic. She still had friends to visit. The following day she went to a friend whose flat overlooked Wavertree Park. It was all very convivial. A rainstorm outside made the mince pies more warming. The chat flowed as easily as the whisky, but she kept glancing at the thin figure who stood in the park, unmoved by the downpour. The trails of rain on the window must be lending him their colour, for his skin looked like a snail's. Eventually the 68 bus, meandering like a drunkard's monologue, took her home to Aberth. No, the man in the park hadn't really looked as though his clothes and his body had merged into a single greyish mass. Tomorrow she was taking the children for their treat, and that would clear her mind. She took them to the aquarium. Piranhas sank stonily, their sides glistening like Christmas cards. Toads were bubbling lumps of tar. Finny humbugs swam, and darting fish wired with light. And while the tanks cracked, there seemed to be a stagnant smell. In the museum, everything was under glass, shrunken heads like sewn leathery handbags, a watchmaker's workshop, buses passing as though their windows were silent films. It was a slum street walled in by photographs of despair, real flagstones underfoot, overhung by street lamps on brackets. She halted between a grid and a drinking fountain. She was trapped in the dimness between blind corners and couldn't see either way. Why couldn't she get rid of the stagnant smell? Grey forlorn faces, pressed like specimens, peered out of the walls. "Come on, quickly," she said, pretending that only the children were nervous. She was glad of the packed crowd in Church Street, even though the children kept letting go of her hands. But the stagnant smell was trailing her, and once, when she grabbed for little Denise's hand, she clutched someone else's, which felt soft and wet. It must have been nervousness which made her fingers seem to sink into the hand. That night she returned to the aquarium and found she was locked in. Except for the glow of the tanks, the narrow room was oppressively dark. In the nearest tank, a large dead fish floated towards her out of weeds. Now, she was in the tank, her nails scrabbling at the glass, and she thought it wasn't a fish, but a snail-coloured hand, which closed spongily on hers. When she woke, a scream made the house sound very empty. At least it was New Year's Eve. After the night she could stop worrying. Why had she thought that? It only made her more nervous. Even when Marjorie phoned to confirm they would first foot her, that reminded her how many hours she would be on her own. As the night seeped into the house, the emptiness grew. A knock at the front door made her start, but it was only Harvey's, inviting her next door for sherry and sandwiches. While she dodged a sudden rainstorm, Mr. Harvey dragged at her front door, one hand through the letterbox, until the latch clicked. After several sherries, Dorothy remembered something she'd once heard. The lady who lived next door before me, didn't she have trouble with her son? He wasn't right in the head. He got so he'd go for anyone, even if he'd never met them before. She got so scared of him she locked him out one New Year's Eve. They say he threw himself in the river, though they never found the body. Dorothy wished she hadn't asked. She thought of the body rotting in the depths. She must go home in case Simon and Marjorie arrived. The Harveys were next door, if she needed them. The sherries had made her sleepy. Only the ticking of the clock, clipping away the seconds, kept her awake. 11:20. The splashing from the gutters sounded like wet footsteps pacing outside the window. She had never noticed she could smell the river in her house. She wished she'd stayed longer with the Harveys. She would have been able to hear Simon's car. 20:12. Surely they wouldn't wait until midnight. She switched on the radio for company. A compere was making people laugh. A man was laughing thickly, sounding waterlogged. She didn't start. They were here at last, though she hadn't heard the car. It was New Year's Day. She ran and had reached the front door when the phone shrilled. That startled her so badly that she snatched the door open before lifting the receiver. Nobody was outside, only a distant uproar of cheers and bells and horns, and Marjorie was on the phone. "We've been held up, Mummy. There was an accident in the tunnel. We'll be over as soon as we can." Then who had knocked? It must have been a drunk. She heard him stumbling beside the house, thumping on her window. He'd better take himself off, or she would call Mr. Harvey to deal with him. But she was still inside the doorway when she saw the object on her step. Good God, was it a rat? No, just a shoe, so ancient that it looked stuffed with mould. It wasn't mould, only a rotting old sock. There was something in the sock, something that smelled of stagnant water, and worse. She stooped to peer at it, and then she was struggling to close the door, fighting to make the latch click, no breath to spare for a scream. She'd had her first foot, and now, hobbling doggedly alongside the house, his hands slithering over the wall, here came the rest of the body.